So welcome to this survey lecture. It's a survey over computational approaches to cognitive science. It's quite an ambitious lecture. It's a new lecture I made up for this course. In the future, we hope to coordinate all the computational lectures around a survey like this. So we begin very generally. So cognitive science, it's about understanding the mind, I suppose, right? And it's a goal that all of you are interested in. And there's another aspect is understanding the brain. And I will very often now refer to what some people call the neurodogma, in which these two issues are linked, where you want to understand how the mind emerges from the brain. Not everyone embraces this idea that you have to combine these two questions, but you will see that a lot of computational approaches actually do. Not all of them do. But this is the neurodogma is very useful to actually first briefly talk about what the mind is supposed to be. I know some of you are really philosophers and think deeply about these questions, so I will use the armchair perspective of a practicing scientist, not a philosopher. And so cognition is very easy to define within the neurodogma, because essentially you could say the brain receives sensory inputs, those transform physics into neural stuff, and the brain generates movements that transforms neural stuff into physics, into behavior. And so everything that's in between is cognition. Very simple. And if it's very direct, then we don't think it's very important kind of cognition. We call these sometimes reflexes or fixed action patterns. When it's not so direct, when there are more distant connections, invariant connection, invariant meaning really that as you change something about the sensory array or something about the motor system, the some functional aspect remains invariant under that. Just as you, for instance, may have a perception of an object and it doesn't depend exactly on its illumination, which changes the retinal image. Or if you abstract from something in some way, that is, you can, for instance, look at numbers and think about numbers without really referring to the particular way in which they are represented graphically. So the more distant, the more cognitive. This very low level kind of approach to cognition. And in my first exercise session, when I talked about Breitenberg vehicles, I used that metaphor to think about what cognitive systems could be from a neural perspective. So with that, I mean, a lot more can be said about that, of course. We can maybe focus on what understanding then what might mean. And here I refer both to understanding the mind or understanding the brain. And the first thing might surprise you. In a way, a challenge is here that the mind and behavior and actually even brains aren't really reproducible per se. If you were to measure everything about them, if you had perfect observation, you would get a myriad of data and it wouldn't be possible to map these data from individual to individual. So for instance, if you had access to the neurophysiology of an individual's nervous system, it would be different from individual to individual. Even in very simple nervous systems, for instance, invertebrate insect nervous systems, that is often true. Certainly true for mammals and absolutely true for primates and us in particular. And I'll say a little bit more about behavior later. And the brain and behavior and so on also changes from moment to moment. That is, if you experience something, if you listen to this lecture, your brain after that is a little bit different because you made some new connections, hopefully, that help you memorize some of the things that we said here. And these differences from moment to moment some of them are long term, when we say that you consolidate what you learn or during development, these differences are consolidated. So understanding the brain certainly cannot mean just describing it very extensively in all detail. And very similarly, understanding behavior, for instance, cannot be thought of in this way. And I start with this maybe surprising angle, because there's something fundamental about that. There's a very nice description of this in chapter 6 of Richard Feynman's book, The Character of Physical Law, very useful. He makes the contrast between physics and geology for some reason, but you could replace geology by biology and think about it deeply. So take a historical example, physics, you have Kepler's 3 laws are famous about how the planets go around the sun, about how much time it takes, and the sun being in the focus of an ellipse and stuff like that. But I'm not sure if all of you know, but Kepler actually spent a lot of time trying to find another law that would describe how, why the planets are in the particular distances they are from the sun. For instance, Mercury and Venus and the Earth and so on have particular half-axis, long axis, or let's say radii, if we approximate the orbits as circles, and why in these distances. And he came up with all kinds of complicated ideas of certain geometrical bodies that would fit in just right and so on. And none of that had any success. And we would say today, well, there is no law that governs the distance from the planets. These distances arise just by chance, by the history of the solar system, how the gas clouds condensed initially, by the initial condition of the solar system. And we have observed other planetary systems in the meantime with very sophisticated techniques in which planets are at different distances from the sun. And so we would say, planetary systems in that respect are not reproducible. It's just by chance. And that's true, of course, very generally. Physical systems are not reproducible. You would not actually dream of writing down all the positions and velocities of all particles in a room or in a lab or anything like that, because you think they are not constraints. They're not reproducible. And that leads to this law-oriented epistemology of physics, where you're essentially saying only if certain things are right, then something else can be predicted. And it's that relationship between if and then, the lawful, which makes the law, that is the contents of science and understanding in physics. So, for instance, given initial conditions, you will predict then future conditions. You can actually also take initial conditions and predict what must have been the case in the past. And in physics, the notion is that if part of a law is very general, then you have a powerful law. There's a lot of generalization. In fact, if the if is very, very specific, then you would say it's a weak law. And so in physics, finding these laws is really what people mean by understanding. And it means essentially that you're finding out about constraints, about which worlds, which physical situations are possible. This can actually goes deep if you think about the second law of thermodynamics. A very interesting topic, but unfortunately I have to limit my excursion into that. So that's quite different from biology. In biology, you find to some extent, in a certain approximation, that organisms are reproducible. Famously these books of how to identify plants, for instance, and these books list a certain number of features that you need to pay attention to classify, for instance, a plant, a flower or something. And then you can predict things about that species. For instance, you could describe in a lot more detail what's in, so if you cut them open, what's inside, a tulip, and then there are certain vesicles and sort of stuff that you learn in high school. So that's possible because they are somewhat reproducible. There are certain aspects of biological systems that are the same from individual to individual, and only certain species exist. These, you could say, abstractly speaking, they're also some kind of laws because they predict these other features, but physicists would not consider them powerful laws because there's very little generalization only within that species. But still, the fact that organisms are reproducible makes extensive description successful, and in biology that is a dominant approach. People describe, for instance, I'll come back to that maybe later, so do a lot of extensive description of systems, and I have it right here. You could say that in neuroscience, understanding the brain, that attitude is sometimes prevalent and successful. And I think one could argue that neuroscience is sort of at the dividing line between these two epistemologies. So very roughly speaking, I don't think that can be very globally said, but roughly speaking, molecular and cellular neuroscience are clearly on the biology side of this epistemology, because they are looking at mechanisms that are largely reproducible and which are extensively described. So you have thesis projects where people really just want to find out if a certain neurotransmitter is active in a certain brain structure, and they think that's progress because they can find out yes or no to which extent that's true, and then that will be reproducible, presumably. Will always be the case if you look at that brain structure. While systems levels neuroscientists interface more with behavior, ultimately, with competencies. And at that level, they don't find that description is enough, because some of these behaviors depend on the history of the individual, development, learning, also on context, on stimuli, on what kind of environment you put the system in. And I'll talk much more about that when I talk about psychology. So yes, behavior and if behavior as a manifestation of cognition is not reproducible as such. I think that's obvious. None of us would say that the behavior and the thoughts an individual generates can be extensively described, because there is only a reproducible set of such things. And it's task, intention, situation, context, individual differences, learning, development, ultimately even culture, all of those contribute to that non-reproducibility, because they introduce dependencies on things that are not lawful, that are not constrained. You have to have a theory of all possible environments, of all possible tasks, and so on to reproduce behaviors. And that fact, that's a very obvious fact, has led to the law-oriented epistemology of psychology that was present from the very start of psychology. Actually, I'll skip this very interesting stuff, but let's skip that. Maybe I'll come back to that in the very end. So at the very start of psychology was really psychophysics. Helmholtz, Wundt, Fechner, a lot of German psychologists were very influential at that early stage. And what they did is they looked for laws of perception, laws of action in physics down. The simplest form, these were laws that linked external physical stuff, the intensity of a stimulus or certain parameters of an action, to essentially the subjective experience measured by having participants estimate the magnitude of a stimulus, deciding if two things were the same or different, so measuring the just noticeable difference between stimuli and so on. So these were measures on the mind, on the conscious mind, by asking people simply to make classification or estimation responses. The technique we're still using pretty much today for measuring behavior. Here an example for, it's actually a very nice review paper by Stevens in 1957 on psychophysics in Psych Review. It's actually very readable. And so Fechner's law, many of you will know that, it essentially establishes that the estimated magnitude of a stimulus depends on the physical intensity in a power law fashion. So when you plot it on a log scale, it's linear. These two dots are measurements, and you can describe then that characteristic by some parameters. Here's an example from that paper of very different kinds of physical continua that can be looked at this way and that lead to a well-defined exponent. And of course, today we would have much more data of that kind. So this is an example of, it's a law, it's a relationship between two different things, and you could compress that data by just describing parametrically that law, right? You could, for instance, estimate the exponent, as I just said, and maybe the offset. And with these two numbers, you would compress this data. That's sort of one principle. of how theory, mathematical modeling of behavior goes about. Mathematical psychology, in fact, is the modern extension of these kinds of ideas. And I wanted to discuss one model as a placeholder for that, to get you a sense for that perspective, that theoretical perspective. So this is a model of decision making. For instance, if you ask participants to make a choice response, two choice task, go, press one button versus another button, maybe as a function of a stimulus. The description then that this class of models proposes is that you would have a decision axis here, a dimension along which you distinguish between different outcomes. There would be one boundary, here the lower boundary, where you, when you connect that boundary, you would, or reach that boundary, you would make one kind of response, and the other boundary would be when you make the other kind of response, A or B, let's say. And the decision is modeled as a random walk. So it's a stochastic process of the state along that dimension. A random walk can be described by two parameters, drift and diffusion. The diffusion is essentially the variance, and the drift is sort of the mean of that. Needs to be described a little bit more precisely. But roughly speaking, it has two parameters, and you have a couple of parameters where you start and how far the starting point is from the two boundaries, essentially. And that gives rise then to predictions about the statistical distribution of these times when you reach the boundaries, depending on these various parameters. And you can use that to fit reaction time distributions. In fact, you can extract the parameter values that capture the reaction time distributions quite precisely. And therefore, in a sense, a reaction time distribution, I'll show you one in a moment, is a lot of data. It's again a whole curve, and you compress that curve into these parameters of the abstract mathematical model, and thus you have data compression. And you can use these parameter values then to actually characterize the task or the individual, and certain conditions, certain variations on the conditions that you can do. And I'll show you an example in a moment. So this approach to theoretical understanding of, in this case, certain competences like decision making, are based on exact mathematical models with well-defined, models for well-defined subfunction. It's typically quite narrowly defined, and these notion is always that you want to have a small set of parameters that capture the constraints, the regularity, and so on, and that can be uniquely identified from data. I should have said identified rather than characterized from data. So this is a well-established subdiscipline of psychology. It's somewhat narrow in the sense that the approach itself strongly limits the kinds of situations that can be reached, where simple mechanisms like that can be developed. It doesn't really provide, it describes the regularity. It doesn't actually provide what we now call a process account. In the end, I will come back to that topic. So for instance, you couldn't actually build a technical system that does achieves the performance of a human by taking this model. It just describes how it's done, but it doesn't really capture how it's done, the processes. It's also difficult to integrate these often into more comprehensive models, to link different sub-functions like that. And of course, it's not necessarily based on neural principles. However, here is a variant that is actually still currently being used a lot in neuroscience, that is sort of a neural interpretation of an abstract model like that. So in this neural interpretation, the decision X is some neural activity of some neurons that you try to find somewhere in the brain. And so the starting point is some resting level that might be varied depending on task set. For instance, in this experimental study was the prior probability of a signal that varied, was assumed to vary that starting level. And then some neural threshold is that one of those boundaries that you go through, and then you're looking for, again, a random process with some drift and some mean to predict reaction time distributions. And these are examples. This is plotting the cumulative probability as a function of latency, this saccadic eye movement where people call reaction times latency. So this is an example of reaction time distribution plotted again in this particular form. And so by fitting curves through these data points, you can determine the parameters of the underlying diffusion model. So here in this case, the experimenters manipulated the a priori probability of a visual target, so how often it occurs in a data set, and then got different reaction time distributions as a function of that. And that's how they were able to map a experimental parameter onto a model parameter, and thus compress the behavior regularity of react to this kind of situation in this model. Is that useful? It's descriptive of that law. It sort of captures the law, describes the law. It's actually useful as an analytical tool when it fails. So for instance, here in this data, you see that there are two linear functions that are needed to account for this data. There is some odd stuff happening with the very fast saccades, which occur a lot when the target is very likely, when you know it's going to be this target. These things are called express saccades, and there's some neural information in the meantime about them. And so you could say the precise model helps uncover the limits of the account. And here it essentially says there are two decisions, two regimes that are different parameters. And you could say you discover that by that lack of a fit. It's actually not historically true because express saccades were known before this model was proposed, but it's a precise way of documenting the need for a additional mechanism for saccadic initiation. So that where the model fails, it's insightful, and failing is best detected by quantitative work. So wouldn't perhaps be able to just see that intuitively if you didn't try to do the quantitative work. I want to make that a point. I want to ask, why would we want to do mathematical modeling generally, rather than just maybe use verbal or conceptual theoretical accounts? So here, even this curve fitting, right? This is, again, just descriptive of the model. Why would we do that quantitatively? Is that really insightful? And what I just illustrated is an example of this being useful, mostly when the model fails, because it then actually points to additional questions you want to ask about the system, where you capture some of the regularity, but you don't capture it precisely. And then you can look at what is needed to repair that, and that often gives rise to interesting questions. I want to take a second example that's maybe a little less abstract from motor control of that kind. It's work that I was involved in many years ago. It's about posture. When you stand upright, you're influenced by the visual array. The visual array is actually one of the mechanisms that stabilize posture. For instance, if you close your eyes in the shower when you have soap in your eyes, then you're more likely to fall because you're using vision to stabilize. Now, if you move forward, the world seems to expand. If you move backward, the world seems to contract. And so you can, just by computing what is called the optic flow, you could extract information about your motion relative to the visual surround. This is studied experimentally in the moving room paradigm. Historically, where people actually moved a wall that you're standing in front of. Here in a laboratory version today, you can do this by projecting onto the screen with some virtual reality aspect. You can actually do a very fancy version of that. And what you find is that when you vary the scene, you can drive a sway. And the classical verbal model of that is that you sway like an inverted pendulum. So just around the ankle, let's say, and that your sway is essentially an oscillator that is coupled to sensory inputs, one of them being vision and others would be vestibular or haptics and so on. Now, in some work back then, we did this quantitatively, which was, this model had been often used, and sort of qualitatively people have argued about it. And we just developed some techniques to do this quantitatively. So this would be the simple model. It's a harmonic oscillator model. So X would be the characterization of body in space. For instance, can be mapped onto the ankle joint. It has two parameters, a damping and an eigenfrequency. This is just the variability, noise strength, and this would be the hypothesized coupling to the visual input, which you can now impose some function on. And you can estimate the parameters of this model by fitting certain dependencies. So here are data in which the frequency of a oscillation of the visual surround was varied, and you measure certain aspects of sway or some technique. You measure something like a gain, something like a phase of the sway, the resulting sway. And you see a few curves fitted here from this model. And you see, for instance, that the dash curve isn't quite right, systematically wrong. And here the solid curve is systematically wrong. And they're, don't go into the details of what these different techniques are, but they are failures of the model. And it turns out if you go more deeply into that, you find that this model is wrong. If you think of these parameters alpha and omega being properties of the postural system that are independent of the visual experience that you have. So they are actually dependent on the visual experience, which means that as you're standing there, your postural system somehow changes, reflecting what happens to your visual surround. So for instance, if you oscillate your visual surround with a certain frequency, then it turns out that you're adapting your stiffness, this omega is sort of your stiffness as a spring, to that visual surround. And that's actually very interesting there. And there's been a lot of work, not all triggered by that work, but partly motivated by the work. And I myself was involved in what is called multisensory reweighting, a form of adaptation that happens all the time. So for instance, that if you close your eyes or if you find that your visual surround is full of movement, like in a car or so, you downweight the contribution of vision. So again, it's the failure of a model to precisely account for data that uncovers additional processes that you might not first have looked at. Okay, so this is gives a little bit of flavor of mathematical models per se, and why quantitative and so on. Still very, very simple kinds of models. So let's more generally think about models. What kind of models would we then need to understand behavior or understand neural processes? And that's often framed as a question of relevant levels of description. There's a famous framing of this levels question that goes back to someone called David Marr. I'm not sure how familiar he is to many of you. He was a computational vision person, so theoretician working on computer vision, but also on human visual psychophysics. He died very young of cancer and was somehow then, his name was always attached to that. So he wasn't really able to develop this so far that we would perhaps then also criticize it. Sometimes it's interesting social dynamics of such ideas. It's still very, very influential idea, I would say, sometimes implicitly used. And so he proposed 3 levels of analysis. An abstract computational level, where you look at principles that would be maybe closest to abstract laws. An algorithmic level that's sort of illustrates how the computational principle could be realized in principle and in a computational sense I'll talk about in a moment. And then an implementation level that he thought of as, in the brain would be the neurons, the hardware, and maybe it could, in technical systems, could be really the kind of sensors you use and the hardware, also how the algorithm functions in real time, what the memory needs are, and so on. So I'll give you a few examples of the computational level. So original examples that David Marr, that motivated his thinking were examples in computational vision. So it's a whole field. It's no longer so active, but in the 90s, it was a very important field. And that is a field in which you uncover essentially something like ecological laws of vision. I listed here the example of optic flow. I already mentioned optic flow. It's the velocity field that you see on your sensory surface when you move through a rigid environment as an observer. And one can theoretically prove that if you have the optic flow, you don't know the environment, you just know it's rigid, that you can then uniquely determine 5 of the observer's ego motion parameters. Right? The observer is a rigid body, is a camera, let's say, or is your eye, has 6 degrees of freedom and sends 3 translational and 3 rotational ones. And of these 6, you can determine 5 uniquely from the optic flow. It's mathematically proven. That one is undetermined is intuitive in the sense that if your environment was scaled up and you were at a larger distance and you were moving at a faster speed, you would get the exact same optic flow. I don't know if that's intuitive, but that can be seen. So it's always up to one scaling factor. So you would need something about your distance or about the scale of the scene to make it unique. So this is just an example of it's really mathematically proven that there is some property here of the world. There's an ecological property of vision. It's actually not something about the nervous system. The nervous system could now exploit that or not, make use of it. And so in that time, for instance, a lot of ideas like that were proposed. For instance, shape from shading. You could show that under certain modeling assumptions about surfaces that reflect light, you could in principle compute the curvature and pose of a surface from its shading pattern. And then people went and looked if the nervous system can actually achieve that. For instance, in the sense that humans can estimate the shape given certain lighting conditions. And if you create conditions where the theorem says you can't estimate the shape, you also humans fail then to do it. And that turned out to be a fruitful research program. There were some regularities that of vision that were identified that way. And very similarly in motor control, there's an approach that's called computational motor control, which is actually the dominant approach to movement, behavior, motor control today. And it's an approach, again, where you propose some abstract computational principles. For instance, you say what kind of movement trajectories would result if the system was minimizing effort, and the effort is this descending motor command. You have to specify a little bit more what that means. Have a model of the physics of the system that moves. You minimize the motor command, you minimize the deviation from some target parameters, like reaching a target in a certain time, and then you get certain kind of trajectories. And if you then compare those trajectories to human trajectories, maybe they match, and then you say, well, that's a principle. We don't know exactly how it's done, but somehow the movement is such that it minimizes that quantity. That's the sort of thinking. And there's similar stuff in cognition proper. Most famous, perhaps, probabilistic approaches. Some of you may know that area. For instance, if you take Bayes' rule, that it tells you somehow how to optimally combine specific information you have about something, some sensory estimate or some classification you want to do, and you have some prior probabilities, what the statistics is of certain outcomes in the world, and then the Bayes rule tells you how to best combine that kind of information. Then you go and look if humans actually do that, and you find, yes, sometimes people do that. So a famous example is people have to decide whether a tennis ball that they maybe see on a computer display was inside or outside of the line, or where it was relative to the line, the kind of thing that the line judge has to decide. And you can then use this kind of approach, characterizing maybe what the the statistics, how often you see a ball being on one side of the line or another. So if you're a judge, you will see a lot of good tennis players who always hit it just on the inside. So you can build up some hypotheses about prior probabilities, and you can then vary the quality of sensory information by making it more or less noisy. And then you see that the estimate or the decision people make vary with that variation of sensory information, exactly like predicted by Bayes' rule, and say, the brain is Bayesian. And there's a lot of examples like that, going all the way into how people map word meanings onto certain inputs, for instance. And so it's a whole field of probabilistic modeling of cognition. And so again, it's not clear exactly how people do that. It's just describing a regularity, some principle from law. So I'm saying this is a very influential idea. Theoreticians love that kind of stuff because they don't have to wet their hands or dirty their hands going into the details of neural stuff or behavior experiment. And can step back, have an abstract perspective. The probabilistic is particularly attractive. You just stay within probability theory. And so that's nice for theoreticians. They become very independent of experiment. It's computation. Why do you call it computation? It's in some abstract sense computation. Computation is ultimately something with an input-output structure. That is, certain things are given and other things are then specified or fixed, and you can compute them, determine them, or prove that they have a unique answer. So that's one sense of computation. That this whole module is called computation. I personally am very critical of it, but it is what gave that name to the field. I'm critical of it because it's actually not clear that a lot of thinking and cognition and behavior has that directionality of some input is given, some output is computed from that. This same sort of notion of computation is also prevalent at the so-called algorithmic level. So the algorithmic level in Marr's conception was an idea of how you could concretely achieve that computation. More specifically, as a process of how you could actually bring it about. That process could then itself, for instance, have recurrent elements. That is, you have to iterate something many times to converge on the right answer. So it would be not a feed-forward, straightforward computation would require perhaps some feedback, for instance, but just as a computational device where there is still some answer that you provide in the end. So, for example, in these classical cases, there are a couple of proposals, concretely algorithms that can be implemented on computers, how to determine the optic flow from sequences of images. And one, for instance, would be taking any patch in one image and match it to any patch in the other image, and where the match is good, you're saying this must have moved there, and that's your vector, and that's how you could construct the optic flow. And there are algorithms implemented. It's the famous Intel library that does that for computer vision, and that will be then a hypothesis about nervous systems do it, and you could try to see certain predictions that would make, for instance, about the kind of match and the kind of errors that this would generate and so on, to then say, well, that must be the algorithm the nervous system implements. Similar motor control is, for instance, a notion of optimal feedback control that I can't explain here in detail, that propose particular control architecture that solves the minimum effort principle that I just mentioned. And people can implement that on a robot, and then they can, again, look for certain signatures of that and see if humans match those, and then say, well, they must be doing optimal feedback control. So I will argue in a moment that information processing accounts of cognition, I'll mention a few more, are sort of at this level, that they propose algorithmic, specific computational methods of how you could achieve a function without actually saying exactly how it's implemented in the brain. This is debated, but I think that's a possible framing of those. I actually think that some connectionist accounts are also of this nature, that they're not really about neural processes, that they're more, it's just algorithms with different elements rather than computer algorithms. They are, in some other abstract sense, algorithms. I'll say a few things about these two things just after I give this summary of the three levels. Last, let's briefly talk about the implementation level. So in the tradition of Marr, and actually for a lot of theoreticians, it was ultimately some kind of dismissal of saying, well, the details with the synapses and all the neurotransmitters and so on, that is like implementation. It's an implementation thing. In other words, it doesn't matter for the function. It is just some way of doing it. You could also have done it differently if evolution had done it differently, and it can be relegated to a separate level. Again, this can be debated. You know, some people think, no, it's the laws are actually constrained by the implementation and reflect the implementation. And I'll have a few slides about computational neuroscience in a model. I would say computational neuroscience models are really thinking hard about implementation and with different maybe claims. I'll have a few examples. So I want to step out of the Marr. You know, I don't think there's universal agreement that the different approaches I'll now discuss are exactly localized at one of those three levels. But I think it's somewhat useful to have this notion of computational, algorithmic, and implementation to sort of order some of these approaches. So I want to talk about information processing, connectionism briefly, computational neuroscience, and then I'll close by talking a little bit about neural processing accounts. So information processing perspective on cognition, is essentially what emerged after the cognitive revolution, essentially the movement against behaviorism, allowing back in the inner state of the brain, of the mind. Herbert Simon, Al Newell, a couple of other people, very famous areas. So this was parallel development in psychology, cognitive psychology then, emerging from that, and in what is now called artificial intelligence, so computer science, of how to build artificial systems that are reflect human cognition in some sense. That was an interesting parallel move, conceptual move in these two fields. And people like Herbert Simon and Al Newell were actually computer scientists. So it was the notion that cognition is some form of computation. The brain is like a computer. It's sometimes called the computer metaphor. And it was more formally actually defined. If you look up some of these texts, you see that cognition is defined as the manipulation of symbols in a way that is described by or constrained by certain rules and programs that you could try to identify as a cognitive psychologist. In psychology, this framework, people were seriously trying to narrow in on that framework, so to see, is that framework right? So is there something about about psychophysics and primarily about behavior, it wasn't so much about neuroscience, that really is consistent with this idea that there is computation. And so some of you may know there was this long debate about modularity. Jerry Fodor and someone called Pelishin argued a lot about that, and still today this argument is going on. So they talked a lot about encapsulation, that there would be different computational elements that encapsulate their inner state. So the inner state is not actually accessible to other modules, and they only transmit well-defined things that would be described by information. I'll make this concrete in a moment. And that information is passed as output to other modules which take it as input. So the modules in that sense are impenetrable. You cannot get to the inner state, and that was used to account for certain properties of perception. So it's been debated for a lot of time. It's always a question how direct that evidence was for impenetrability. But this was an important principle because that would be a principle of how you could actually identify and isolate functional modules. So the big cognitive architecture or brain would do all kinds of things to achieve a particular task. And the hope was that we can find the reproducible aspect of it, the laws of principle, by saying that it's made by components which have a fixed function. And that function does not depend on what happens elsewhere in the architecture. It always does the same thing. And this would be the formalization of it. By encapsulating it, would make sure that it always does the same thing, no matter why it was called, for which reason. The most elaborate forms of this kind of theoretical thinking are the cognitive architectures. ACT-R is maybe the most, still most used one and most developed one. SOAR was actually, I think, was proposed early, and there are a couple more that are not so still used. I didn't want to list them all. They have these funny acronyms. Here are some quotes from Anderson's, one of Anderson's books. James Anderson writes, or it's John Anderson. John Anderson writes regularly new review books. This is, I think, his latest book in 2007, where he summarized the state of his ACT-R architecture. And I could have a little quote here from that book, where he says a cognitive architecture is a specification of the structure of the brain at the level of abstraction that explains how it achieves the function of the mind. So you can see that there's this explicit idea to abstract from the neurons, the implementation level, to the more abstract functional characterization through a cognitive architecture. And maybe useful to give you a few concrete ideas how ACT-R is done, and you could say similar things about SOAR. So the historical origin of ACT-R was actually a so-called spreading activation model of memory, 83. And in that model, there were things that Anderson called elements. Each element had an activation variable associated with it, which evolved in time according to some fixed rule. And between the elements, you would pass activation. So an element could give activation to some other element. And what these elements stand for, so what they represent, that's fixed. So we'll see in a moment some examples of such elements. So they could, so you would just say whether an element is activated or not, but the element would always stand for instance, a word, a letter, a number, an operation, a certain kind of thought, and so on. And this kind of model was used to account for how the recall of a memory, for instance, depends on the structure of the memory, and the activation traces here, how long they take, how much needs to be activated in order to recall a sequence, for instance, would be the kind of data that this model would capture. So in a more general framework of today, these elements have been generalized to so-called chunks. They are symbolic elements, again, symbolic in the sense that they stand for something. These people talk about standing for facts, which could be a memory, but it could also be rules or operations. It could be a perceived item. It could be a motor command. And with every fact, so with the contents is associated a sub-symbolic thing, the graded time-varying activations, and some weights that determine how strongly one such chunk influences other chunks, weights like this, and that govern the activation. So you see the symbols have always the invariant meaning. The meaning is fixed, that's symbolic, but whether or not that meaning is currently influencing other chunks, that is what evolves in time according to graded variables like activation. So when you activate a chunk beyond a threshold, that was kind of a neural idea here, then it is brought about. Whatever that chunk stands for is brought about. When they say it's produced, it's a production, or the production fires, as they say. And so whatever it stands for is becoming effective. For instance, if it's an operation like addition, then the addition is performed. They don't actually say how the addition is performed. That is something outside the description. It just describes what is needed in order to activate that operation, and the operation is just assumed given. So have some detailed mathematical account for that activation. I call that activation. They call it activation dynamics. I put that in quotation marks because it's not activation dynamics in the sense of a dynamical system. There is some time course dependence. For instance, the probability of retrieval of an item is assumed to be a certain function of activation and time. It's actually that the key issue is that the time to activate, to retrieve depends on activation level in a certain way. And there are rules of how the weights, activation depends on inputs with certain weights and so on. But that's always, just that sub-symbolic level. That's the neural analogy, let's say. But what the individual chunk stands for, is independent of that. So here, an example: if you do mental arithmetic, then you get certain kind of input. For instance, 3 plus x. I don't know if that's supposed to be, 3 plus whatever x, what you will have, the variable that you will have to determine equals h, and you get the task of solving the equation. And with these kind of inputs, you fire a certain procedural chunk, which is the subtraction chunk, and that makes an output, I guess. Actually, I don't know. It should be 5, right? I don't know where that will be then produced. And more complex things like that can happen. They often use mental arithmetic to do things like that. And so the outcome of this sort of thinking would ultimately be a cognitive architecture of the mind. And they are concretely working toward that, and that cognitive architecture would reflect computational constraints. Or one important computational constraints are bottlenecks that are empirically observed, and they are represented in these architectures by thinking that there is some kind of central procedural controller, cognitive controller, that takes all kinds of visual, vocal, oral inputs and outputs, manual or sorry, vocal was actually motor, manual or vocal motor outputs, and you can have access to memory databases and so on. You can modulate the process by giving goals. And then that model would account for how you achieve goals with these resources. And I put literal quotes into the slides so you can read that. I felt that this was a very good summary. These 2 pages, a very good summary of the thought. So if you want to know a little bit about that, these 2 slides, read those 2 slides. You can get a flavor, a sense for the flavor without reading the whole book. So when people make these kind of models, what they take as evidence comparing something about computational effort to human experiments. And there are different ways of doing that, often to reaction time or to the time people need to achieve particular operations. Here's an example from mental arithmetic, which is one of their workhorse examples, where they have children or adults do certain operations, here characterized by the stages in a algorithmic procedure that people use to do mental arithmetic. And then you look how much time they spend at every step and compare that to the model. And if there's some match of that structure of how people go through that task, and you say, I have captured the mental processes involved in that task. And of course, it's a fitting process in the sense that you're twiddling with the architecture until it's right, and that's how you can use it as a tool of discovery, of extracting the regularities again in the data. I would say that these constraints are not very powerful, because it's often very powerful behaviors that involve a lot of things, and you have just a few numbers to characterize overall its time structure, I mean the durations. So it's not a very strong constraint. You could have multiple different solutions for the same time structure, but it's some kind of constraint. So today, it's interesting. It's a field that is still alive. There is a whole community doing these kind of models. It's kept alive in large part by applications in cognitive ergonomics, where human factors work, where you look at how much, for instance, the computer interface, how much cognitive load that generates, and you do detailed modeling of the processes for that. And for instance, currently for driver assistance systems, it's an active field. And it still provides somehow the theoretical backdrop, I would say, for much work in higher cognition. It's also this new branch of it where this sort of thing is used to map processes onto imaging data. So you just say, now this module is in that area and so on, by comparing the activation in a task in a submodule to the activation time courses in a task across the brain. It's not mainstream, but it's used somewhat in that sense. But it's, I would say it's been on the defensive for maybe a decade or more under the onset of connectionism, because of course it is fundamentally not consistent with what we know about neurons, because even though these activation variables are sort of neural, to think that a particular subunit of neurons that is a module here has attached to it some computation, for instance, like this rule can do an addition, or that is very unclear how that would actually be done by neurons, because the neurons really just fire or don't fire. They don't take information and operate on that information. It's not clear how they can do symbolic stuff. In mental arithmetic, that's particularly clear. So particularly questionable how neurons could do addition, subtraction, and so on. Actually, there is not new ideas about that within our approach, but certainly not in ACT-R. So I would say that they have been in psychology sort of on the defensive for a long time for that reason. And it was connectionism largely that sort of replaced this perspective. So connectionist models are have essentially the claim that they do brain-style computation, and they have argued initially against this rigid modularity imposition, although their intellectual origins are not really so different, and there's a strong conceptual overlap. Sometimes I wonder if connectionist models are simply more fuzzy and not theoretically so sharply defined, and so there's not maybe this strong contrasts that are being drawn. But I'm not exactly sure about that. So here's an example of a historically important connectionist network that was, I mentioned that to point at the origins. It's in the 91 paper McLaren-Dremmelhart about word recognition. And you see, it's actually interesting. They have nodes that stand for fixed things. This stands for the letter A, N, T, and so on. This stands for certain line elements, and these stand for words. And then they have these connections. Along these connections, activations are passed. The connectivity is much more complex than in ACT-R, but it has sort of the same outlook, right? That the nodes stand for something, and that they don't actually say exactly how that comes about, that it stands for something. Now that can be improved. Now I'll talk about that in a moment. And so when you do that, then you come up with architectures, cognitive architecture. You could say, rather than have these fixed boxes, now you have clouds of neurons, and these clouds are supposed to represent different levels of representation, like words and letters and features, as I just showed you. And the other aspect of that, what do they actually account for? And when they accounted for really processing, it was actually the same thing. They accounted for some constraints on processing time. So predicting that some things would take longer to process than other things. For instance, it would say that as you elaborate a word, the activation of the right word, the matching word, would grow, but initially other words that overlap with the input would also be activated. Looking for signatures in different kinds of errors that you make, or in response times, would then give you access to, reflect constraints from this level. So not really so different from the early spreading activation models. The one thing that was really different was the learning. I'll come to that. Here's a more recent review that shows that the connectionist field is a very broad field, and very different kinds of models are all called connectionist. That includes recurrent models, even though I will be talking largely about feed-forward thinking in this domain. And all of them share this core idea that is really the strength of this approach. It's the idea that the many parameters of these models, many, because the connectionist models have way more parameters than these mathematical psychology models, and they don't embrace this philosophy of mathematical psychology that compressing the data to a small number of parameters is the actual value of a model. And so these many parameters could be determined easily from data, from a lot of data typically, by something that was named learning in analogy to human learning, even though the proposals in this field for how that's done have really nothing or little to do with what humans do when they learn. They are essentially a form of fitting. The most popular approach, the backpropagation approach, is clearly a form of fitting, where you say what the right answer is to the network, and you're using the difference between the answer the network gives and the right answer to determine the parameter so that it will get closer to the right answer. That's essentially a form of fitting. It's nothing that would be really related to the experience of learning something. And in that sense, the connectionist networks also are computational. So they have a certain set of inputs, and then there is a certain set of outputs that they have to predict. And even though the network itself might be recurrent, that what constrains its function is really that input-output relationship. Now, some of them are exactly feed-forward, and in my exercise session, I talked about that. But even those that are not exactly feed-forward, like these ones here, conceptually often are essentially computation in the sense that they have an answer to a given input, even though they compute the answer in some iterative way. So one could actually argue that these are algorithmic computational in that sense. So this learning procedure is not a good description of the process of learning, but it is able to uncover structure in the data. Structure, it represents the statistics of that kind of data, and that's become now a mainstream field of computer science and machine learning. So here's the historical example. This is a late review, but the example dates back to Rumelhart, where there would be the representation of different concepts would be a network that binds features to the concept. For instance, different animals like a canary is a kind of bird, right? And that would be connected to can sing, can fly, can grow, can move, and some other things. And so it was supposed to be a distributed representation where you have a network of nodes standing for different things. See, again, these networks, the nodes just stand for something, sort of like symbols. But what you find out is when you learn these connections from data, you give this system a lot of examples of birds or of canaries, then the system would learn these relationships, these patterns, and could, for instance, predict about neighborhood relationships, which things would be similar in terms of the connectivity pattern overlapping. And that could explain, for instance, how you, that's a classification performance. Would be some of the experimental tests on that. So this capturing of the structure of representations, that's really the main strength of the connectionist approach. It's often also not always quantitative, it's often qualitative. So I'm not going to expand much on that. Sen Cheng will give a whole lecture about specific approaches to these so-called learning mechanisms, and then also lead over to learning processes that are closer to actual process learning, for instance, reinforcement learning, that would be close to what animals actually do. And Lawrence Viscott used, of course, the connectionist networks to explain tuning curves, depth fields, and showed use some principles. You could actually say, I don't remember if he did slow feature analysis, but his slow feature analysis could be thought of as a computational principle at the level of connections. Okay, so I don't want to say more about connections, and it will show up in a lot of lectures, I assume. And I get my second exercise session referred to that. Now, computational neuroscience overlaps with connectionism, but I would say it has a little bit different outlook. And it's not sharp. Some people use these terms a little interchangeably, but so not everyone uses them very sharply, let's say. But one could perhaps put up another extreme where you're using neural network models, but you're using them in a way that where the neuromechanistic basis of such computational connectionist computation is taken seriously. And it's taken seriously by using a much lower level, neurophysically realistic approach. For instance, we're taking Hodgkin-Huxley model, a model of synapse dynamics, where the really physical parameters like the concentration of certain neurotransmitters and so on are part of the description. And then try to derive from that something that is linked somehow to behavior. So I'll give you an example that was actually a group that existed here in Bochum. Dostowitz was a group leader in Onno Günterkun's lab. He's now in Würzburg or somewhere there's now in Darmstadt or in some other city. He has a nice chair for computational neuroscience. So he developed a model that he called a neurocomputation model of working memory. And I thought it's very useful example, because it takes a phenomenon like working memory and takes it as a neural phenomenon. So this is data which I don't remember where it's from. It's from this paper, and it's from some other group. I think it's maybe in the frontal brain somewhere. And it's the frontal eye fields, I believe. And it's a monkey who has to make a saccade to one of these 8, I think, is it 8? Locations on the visual array, and the monkey is informed about which saccade it's required to make to be rewarded at some point. It's this interval here, C, where it gets that stimulus, and then it has to wait until it gets a go signal. And then at this R, the response signal, it can then make the saccade. If it makes the saccade earlier, it doesn't get rewarded, right? So it learns to endure that delay. And during that delay, neural activity that you see is then interpreted as being related to the working memory for which choice it was, which target it was that monkey will make a movement to. So what you see here is that this is a neuron that is somehow specialized to this particular direction. So when this direction is cued, it fires, and then it sustains its firing when the visual cue to the target is removed. Until then, during the response, it also fires. And so this pattern of activity is then called the working memory. That's the thing you have to account for in this model. And so this model uses a much more microscopic description. It uses an integrate and fire spike neural network. So integrate and fire means that you have some model of the membrane dynamics. It's a very simple model of membrane dynamics. It has a few parameters, also has some cynetic dynamics, and it has some overall network structure, which is relatively generic. And the kind of questions that you can ask when you do that is, for instance, if the firing pattern that you observe in the sustained experiment, so this would be neurons that are candidates for being the ones to model, and under some conditions they have this nice pattern of firing more when they get input, but when they are in sustained mode they fire less, but in a steady way. While you find that if you use model parameters in a different range, for instance, a faster time scale of membrane dynamics, then the sustained firing isn't as good, or it can die out. And so here's exactly an attempt to link a low-level thing like the time scale of the membrane to a functional thing, and can the neuron fire in a sustained fashion or not? And so this leads to the kind of approaches or predictions that, for instance, varying the dopamine level that affects the function of, for instance, some of the inhibitor neurons will facilitate working memory or not. And then you make predictions about people, with addiction, for instance, will they have better or worse working memory and so on. That's sort of like the research program. In fact, Daniel Dostowitz was quite convinced that he could predict behavior effects quantitatively from microscopic parameters like that. I very much doubt that, and I had very controversial discussions with him about that. But I think one has to push it as far as he likes to show that there is some possible connection where you can do mechanistic stuff and somehow correlate that with functional stuff. So is this, it's clearly a account for regularity in the nervous system at the implementation level. Is this a reductionist approach? That is the claim that by understanding the dynamics of membrane synapses, the detailed neurocircuitry, everything else just emerges from that. So you don't need any other assumptions at any other level. Or is this simply a link across levels? So it's an account for neuromechanistic factors. So for a basis for saying, well, when you experience stress, your memory capacity is going to go in a certain direction, or things like that. There are different expectations, different claims about that. There is a community who really has this reductionist perspective, but there are also people who I think more realistically really just view it as a link where in some very macroscopic or gross way, or not gross, I mean, coarse-grained way, you link neuromechanistic factors to function. In fact, there is a line of opinion in neuroscience where people talk about degeneracy, where they think there is no one-to-one mapping between neuromechanism and behavioral or cognitive mechanism. That you can bring about the same macro state by different microstates in a systematic way. There, under some circumstances, certain realizations are done than under others. There's a neuroscientist of emotion, Barrett Cohen, I think is her name. I always forget her. Barrett is one of her last names. She wrote a beautiful book about that, and she's famous for debunking some of the myths in that domain, for instance, about these core emotions. And one thing that she showed, for instance, is that even though there is a correlation between the activation of the amygdala and the experience of sensing fear, there are situations when people are in some reasonable sense fearful and the amygdala does not fire, and there are situations where the amygdala fires and people are not fearful. And so the relationship is complex, not one-to-one. I have a chat question here. Quickly look at that. Yeah, Lisa Feldman-Barrett, exactly. If you look into chat, Timon Kunze, remember the correct name. Thank you. So, where am I? So, if you see this is a little bit of a criticism of the MAR approach. So, if you take these different levels as a given, you now come back to the epistemological tradition. Is it really that only the computational levels is about laws and the implementation level is only about description? That's certainly not clear. And I would say that it's not, I mean, it's useful, the levels are useful as a way of classifying work by scientists. But I'm not sure that it is something that can really be consistently used to talk about what understanding the mind means. And I want to make a last point about that, which comes closer to from my own work. So I have actually recently written a paper that you can read at your risk in this topics journal of the Cognitive Science Society, that essentially claims that the level of description, so I'm in the neurodogma, so I'm really thinking about ultimately biological description, at which there are laws, sometimes people just call them principles, because not quite as physical laws, it's more qualitative kind of laws, at which there are laws of behavior or of cognition. That which level of description captures these laws is an empirical question that we have to find out. That it's not something that we can just postulate. And that essentially when you propose a particular level through your theoretical language, that then if that gives rise to the discovery of regularities that we can call laws, then that's good. then you have a theory. That's actually how it works in physics. That's what I'm arguing there. It's actually in physics, it's not as reductionist as it is often taught. You know, sometimes physics is taught as everything is quantum field theory, and then, you know, just then everything more macroscopic emerges from that. That's actually not true. In some deep sense, it's not true. You can ask me about that. And I cite work in this paper that clarifies that in physics it's not like that. So the sort of things that are hinted at in the exercise session about neurodynamics is connected to that line of thinking. So it's more specifically in this hypothesis, I'm claiming that the laws of behavior and of cognition are really found or expressed at the level of the dynamics of neural populations in the brain. So time evolution of activation activity in the brain, populations being, you know, thousands of neurons. I'm not talking about the scale of imaging. I'm talking about a smaller scale, but I'm not also talking about individual neurons or you know, neuromechanistic variables. And examples of the kinds of constraints that give rise to laws are these stability constraints that I talked about in that exercise session that give rise to the notion that functional states should be attractor states, even though they might exist only briefly in time. And then the constraints about essentially sequential activation of such things that have to do with the instabilities that I discussed in the exercise. I discussed it in terms of single neuron and two neurons, and in more general sense, we do that for fields. So neural maps, essentially, low dimensional, still neural maps, and try to reach a lot of different phenomena that way. And you know, we have a book and there's a web page I'm teaching about that. So there's a lot of information available about that. I wasn't going to use this lecture to introduce that again. Some of you are listening to my main lecture course that's all about that, and my exercise sessions pointed a little bit in this direction. So I'll summarize. Actually, I thought I had one set on neuroprocess. Here, yeah, I wanted to say something about that, neuroprocess account. So, this is a language in which, so you're trying to identify laws, yes, but there's some additional element to that. It's an element that actually also Feynman talked about. Feynman once famously said that what you cannot build, and in later context, he said what you cannot simulate, at least, you don't understand. That can be debated, but that's a possible perspective. And so there's a notion that that it might not be enough to just describe the regularities, the laws, but there might be also a need to really understand the processes, how they are brought about. You know, in physics, these two things are often the same. That is, you know, we can't build planetary systems because of just some energy limitations, but we can take simpler mechanical systems and build them simply by arranging mechanical matter, you know, masses and so on, in a correct arrangement, and then really they do the thing that we have described by the laws. And one could maybe similarly think, can we understand how behavior emerges from the brain by, in the extreme case, maybe building a brain and showing that it can behave? Well, we wouldn't have to build a brain in this reductionist sense, because the claim, if my claim is correct, is that the details of spiking and neurotransmitters and so on doesn't actually matter for function, that the function is invariant under that. What matters are the patterns of connection between populations and their dynamics. And so by writing down models of that nature and realizing these models physically, for instance, we can do that by solving the equations on a computer and linking that computer to sensors and motors. We can actually show that an agent with sensors and motors can actually show the behavior and the regularity of behavior that the law is supposed to capture. The more radical version of that would be neuromorphic implementation. So you could actually build artificial nervous systems that capture the right level of description, which would be small populations of neurons, and directly link these kinds of hardware, this sort of hardware, to sensors and motors. And that's done in neuromorphic computing by some of my colleagues. I'm actually involved in a project right now about that, where we use Intel's low-EHI chip, they call it, or low-I-Hi, I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, to link on a real robot vehicle, and linking that to so-called event-based camera that emulates the retina, and actually link it to conventional servo motors to bring about very simple behaviors, for instance, like a little robot that can do serially ordered behaviors that it learned from demonstration. So the neural process account adds something to just capturing the laws by describing the laws. It also says we do that, and we do it in a way that we can actually build or simulate that system. Simulate, it always depends on how detailed is the simulation, how realistic is it, and do that in a way that is close to being able to physically realize it. So that's a dimension that's not really so present in a lot of the history of thought in cognitive science, and I'm one of the proponents for that, to add that. I think it's a very useful heuristic tool as well, because very often, like in the failures of models that I mentioned earlier, when you try to build something that works with these principles, you often discover that it doesn't work, and that something is missing or something is wrong. I was involved famously in a demonstration where we built a robot model of a developmental psychology model, and it didn't work. And we found that we had violated one of our own dogmas by not making the behavior stable. And because it was unstable, it didn't really work. And then we fixed that, and that actually led to new insights. So I'll lecture about that in my other course, actually maybe even tomorrow, about that particular. No, it will be a little later in the course that I mentioned about that. Okay, so this is this neural process story. So that's a little bit outside that tradition. So to summarize, I have tried to argue that mathematical models are important to sharpen scientific discourse and thinking. I haven't actually made it explicit enough, perhaps even just being able to mathematically formalize a verbal or conceptual account often already forces you to be precise, to actually make sure that you know what you're talking about, what you really mean. And then I gave you two examples of how quantitative accounts for data can help uncover problems and overlooked aspects and so on. And that's my mantra always, that models are mostly interesting when they fail. When they don't fail, it just means there is no bug, there is no particular problem that limits the capacity of that model to account for something. But it doesn't mean really as much. Of course, models tend to love their models because it's very hard work to do them. And so they often think of the model as the product. But the model is actually just a tool. It's sort of like a consistency check that your discourse is okay. There is no bug in your discourse. They don't really mean much more than that, frankly. And they are particularly interesting when they fail. That's why if you're have enough self-confidence, you should really go for the failure all the time. And then I try to point out that the models all make conceptual commitments, sometimes implicitly so, often explicitly so. And it's actually these commitments in which the theory lies, or that make the theory. And I mentioned Mars levels as a way to organize the different kinds of conceptual commitments modelers make, where computation is a very strong metaphor. One such commitment, and very common these days. It's not conceptually neutral. It's a commitment in which you emphasize the input-output function of parts of the nervous system or parts of the mind, and where you emphasize the abstract level of what it is that you're taking as given and what it is that you compute, which often abstracts from, for instance, the sensory motor processes that actually bring about the behavior. It's very popular, but it doesn't mean that it's necessarily deep. And the last point I made is that the levels, maybe also in the Mars sense, at which lawful aspects of the mind, of the behavior in the brain, can be captured, is ultimately an empirical question that we have to find out about. Do let's say synaptic mechanisms actually lead to constraints that can be observed at the level of behavior, or not, as the degeneracy idea suggests. And you can go all the way through to ultimately information processing accounts. So to come back to my initial question, so what would it mean then to understand the mind and the brain? It's not reproducible. I like this image of possible minds, or possible brains. That is, if you find out about constraints or laws, then what you do is you narrow down the range of possibilities. Just like I said, possible physics or possible physical systems, you could think of possible minds. I sometimes think, there's a sort of a story to tell. If you had all the data you wanted, you can think of a neuroscientist who would have all the whole brain in its computer. I've measured everything about a brain. There's actually the Blue Brain project literally aims at that, actually. It's not the whole brain, it's a part of visual cortex where they have all the connectivities and all parameters estimated from invasive experiments in a big brain database, and that database actually can even give rise to simulation of activation time courses. And so that's a brain in a database. So does that mean you understand it? And I've argued no, because these measurements are not reproducible perfectly. If you don't isolate that little slice, that Blue Brain project, actually the brain is disconnected from senses and motors and doesn't have tasks and so on, very far from any behavioral description. And if you were to embed a system like that in an environment and so on, the behavior wouldn't be reproducible. It would be not reproducible from individual to individual. And you can think if a graduate student had just cheated and actually didn't measure everything, had just made up the data, you would have a good theory of the brain if you can pick out that bad data set, because that would be a brain that's not possible because it violates some principles. Of course, it would be a question of how clever that student was. If everything is full of zeros or so, or ones, that would be easy to pick out. So it's not an easy way to actually measure how much you understand, because it depends again on the cleverness. Very same argument applies to behavior or cognition. If you had done every possible experiment with a person in the lab, you had all the data about someone's behavior. Do you then understand the mind? And again, it would actually not even converge, because if you come up with new tasks, there could still be something you can't really predict. But it would constrain what are possibilities. You would, for instance, perhaps establish links. You would say, those people who are good at discrimination in this task should also be good at discrimination in that task, or understand links like that. That's what laws are about. So one could think of understanding the mind and the brain as understanding what minds and what brains are possible out of the infinite continuum of possibilities.